The blood-soaked wanted poster fluttered in the wind, tacked to the weathered post outside Yancey Keller's cabin. It wasn't his own face on that poster, it was his bride's. The memory of that day 7 years ago still burned like whiskey in an open wound. Yancey had sworn then he'd never stand before another preacher as long as he drew breath. Love was a fool's game in the wild Dakota Territory, and Yancey Keller was no fool. The summer of 1874 scorched the plains surrounding Florissant, Colorado, leaving the land thirsty and the cattle restless. Yancey's ranch, modest but respectable, sat nestled against the foothills where a natural spring provided reliable water even in the driest seasons. It wasn't much, but it was his 40 acres, 28 head of cattle, and a solitude as vast as the sky above. At 32, Yancey had the weathered look of a man who'd seen too much too soon. His dark hair, usually hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, showed touches of premature silver at the temples. His eyes, a piercing blue that could freeze a man's words in his throat, rarely softened these days. "Rusty, get them strays back in line," Yancey called to his ranch hand, a boy of 19 with hair the color of a new copper penny. The cattle were growing agitated as a storm brewed on the horizon. "Yes, sir, Mr. Keller," Rusty replied, spurring his horse toward the wandering steers. Yancey glanced at the darkening sky. A flash of lightning illuminated the distant mountains, and he calculated the time before the downpour would hit. Enough time to finish their work, but not much to spare. "Let's get these cattle to higher ground," he instructed. "That creek's gonna flood by nightfall." As they guided the small herd toward the protected pasture, Yancey spotted a plume of dust on the horizon. A lone rider approached, pushing hard against the coming storm. Instinctively, his hand moved to the revolver at his hip. "Rusty, finish up here." "I'll see who's coming." Yancey rode out to intercept the stranger, stopping at a cautious distance as the rider came into view. It wasn't a man as he'd expected, but a woman. She wore practical riding clothes, her dark blonde hair braided and tucked beneath a hat that had seen better days. Her horse was lathered and breathing hard. "Madam," Yancey called out, tipping his hat slightly, "you're riding mighty hard with a storm coming." The woman pulled her exhausted horse to a stop. "Are you Yancey Keller?" His eyes narrowed. "Depends on who's asking." She straightened in her saddle. "Pearl Hawkins. I was told in town you might be hiring. I need work, Mr. Keller." Yancey almost laughed. "I don't hire women." Pearl Hawkins didn't flinch. "I can rope, ride, and brand as well as any man, better than most. I need the job, and from what I heard in town, you need the help." Thunder rumbled closer, and the first fat raindrops began to fall. Yancey eyed the woman's exhausted horse and the determination in her face. "Town's 5 miles back that way," he said, gesturing over his shoulder. "You won't make it before this storm hits full force." As if to emphasize his point, lightning cracked across the sky, startlingly close. Pearl's horse skittered nervously. "You can shelter in my barn until it passes," Yancey conceded. "Then you can head back to town." "And the job?" Pearl persisted. "There is no job," Yancey said flatly. "Not for you." The rain began to fall in earnest as they rode toward the ranch, the cattle safely corralled on higher ground. By the time they reached the barn, they were both soaked to the skin. Rusty had made it back ahead of them and was securing the doors against the wind. "Mr. Keller," Rusty acknowledged, then noticed Pearl. "Madam," he touched the brim of his hat politely. "Miss Hawkins needs shelter from the storm," Yancey explained. "She'll be leaving once it passes." Pearl dismounted gracefully despite her sodden clothes. "Thank you for the temporary hospitality, Mr. Keller." Rusty took the reins of her horse. "I'll tend to your mount, madam. Her name's Penny," Pearl said, "and thank you." Yancey gestured toward the small cabin. "You can dry off inside, I've got coffee." Pearl followed him across the muddy yard to the cabin. It was simple but solid, one main room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, shelves stocked with provisions, and a narrow bed in the corner. A curtained-off area presumably served as storage. "It's not much," Yancey said gruffly, stoking the fire. "It's dry, Pearl replied, removing her hat and setting it near the fire to dry. Her braid, now loose, fell down her back in a damp rope. Yancey busied himself with the coffee pot, uncomfortable with the female presence in his cabin. It had been years since a woman had crossed his threshold. The last had been Victoria, and that memory was best left buried. "Why are you really here, Miss Hawkins?" he asked, his back to her as he worked. "Like I said, I need work. There are plenty of places that hire women in town, the hotel. The laundry." "I'm not suited to laundry work," she said simply. Yancey turned, studying her. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 25 or so. Despite her bedraggled appearance, there was a quiet dignity about her. And something else, a wariness in her eyes that spoke of someone who'd learned to watch her back. "Where are you from?" "East," she answered vaguely. "That narrows it down," he said dryly. "Missouri originally, then Kansas, and now Colorado." She accepted the steaming cup he offered. "Seems that way." Running from something, her eyes flashed up to meet his. "Aren't we all, Mr. Keller?" The directness of her gaze unsettled him. He turned away, moving to the window to watch the rain lashing against the glass. "The stage comes through town twice a week," he said. "Tuesday and Friday. You can be on your way to Denver or Santa Fe by the end of the week." "I don't want to be on my way anywhere," Pearl said firmly. "I've done enough moving. I need to stay put, and to do that I need work." Yancey sighed. "Look, Miss Hawkins, just hear me out," she interrupted. "1 week. Give me 1 week to prove what I can do. If I can't pull my weight, I'll leave without argument. I already have Rusty. And from what I heard in town, you lost 2 hands last month to the silver mines. One man can't manage a ranch and cattle, even a small spread like this." Yancey frowned. "The town sure seems to know my business. Small towns always do." They fell silent as the storm raged outside. Yancey knew she was right, he needed help. The mines were drawing men away from ranching work with promises of quick riches, leaving him short-handed at a critical time. "Where would you stay?" he asked finally. "The barn would do fine." Yancey shook his head. "No, there's a small cabin about 100 yards from here. Used to be for the previous owner's mother. It's basic but sound." Pearl's eyes widened slightly, suggesting she hadn't expected him to agree so readily. "Then you'll give me the chance? 1 week, he said firmly. "Starting tomorrow. Same pay as my male hands, $3 a week plus room and board." "That's fair," she nodded. "And Miss Hawkins?" "Yes. I don't know what you're running from, and I don't care to know, but I don't want trouble on my land." "Understood." Pearl met his gaze steadily. "Perfectly, Mr. Keller. I don't want trouble either." The storm continued through the night. Yancey set up a bedroll near the fire for Pearl and retreated to his own bed, but sleep eluded him. The presence of a woman under his roof stirred memories he'd long suppressed. Victoria's face haunted his dreams whenever he drifted off Victoria as she'd been on their wedding day, and Victoria as she'd been the last time he saw her, cold and distant with a gun in her hand. Morning came with clearing skies. Yancey rose before dawn, as was his habit, to find Pearl already awake and folding her borrowed blankets. "You're an early riser," he commented. "Farm habits," she replied. "Sun up, work begins," he nodded, appreciating that practicality despite himself. "We'll get you settled in the cabin after breakfast, then start work." They rode out after a simple meal, with Rusty joining them to show Pearl the boundaries of the property. The creek had risen as Yancey had predicted, but the cattle were safe on higher ground. "Main thing this week is moving the herd to summer pasture and branding the spring calves," Yancey explained. "Think you can handle that?" Pearl adjusted her hat against the morning sun. "Like I said, Mr. Keller, I can rope and brand with the best of them." Rusty glanced at her skeptically, but kept his thoughts to himself. They spent the morning rounding up strays that had wandered during the storm. Pearl proved herself to be an excellent horsewoman, guiding Penny with subtle shifts of weight rather than heavy use of the reins. By midday, Yancey had to admit, though only to himself, that she worked as efficiently as any cowhand he'd hired. After a quick meal of jerky and hardtack in the saddle, they began moving the herd toward the summer grazing lands. The work was dusty and tiring, with the cattle stubborn after being disrupted by the storm. "Watch that one on the left," Yancey called to Pearl. "He's a runner," she nodded, positioning herself to block the steer's escape route. When the animal made its break, she was ready, turning it back to the herd with a skill that impressed even Rusty. "Where'd you learn to handle cattle like that, Miss Hawkins?" the young man asked during a brief rest. "My pa ran cattle in Missouri," she answered. "Small operation, but I was his only child, had to learn everything." "Your pa teach you to shoot too?" Yancey asked, noticing the revolver holstered at her hip. "He did," she confirmed. "Said a woman alone needs to protect herself." "Wise man," Yancey commented. By the time the sun hung low in the western sky, they had the herd settled in the summer pasture. Pearl had proven her worth several times over, working without complaint despite what must have been aching muscles. "We'll start branding tomorrow," Yancey informed her as they rode back to the ranch. "For now, let's get you settled in that cabin." The small structure stood in a grove of cottonwoods, its chimney leaning slightly but otherwise solid. Inside was a single room with a small fireplace, a narrow bed frame, a table, and a chair. Dust and cobwebs testified to its disuse. "It needs some attention," Yancey admitted, but the roof's sound. Pearl stepped inside, surveying the space. "It's more than adequate, Mr. Keller, thank you. There are linens in the trunk," he pointed to a wooden chest in the corner, "and I'll have Rusty bring over some firewood." She nodded, running a hand along the dusty table. "I can manage from here." Yancey hesitated at the door. "Supper's in an hour, you're welcome to join us." "Thank you," she said. "I'll be there." As promised, Pearl arrived at the main cabin an hour later. She'd clearly made use of the time to wash up and change into a clean shirt. Her hair was neatly braided again, and she'd replaced her gun belt with a simple leather one. Rusty had prepared a simple but hearty stew, and the three ate mostly in silence, the men unused to female company and Pearl seemingly content with the quiet. After the meal, Rusty excused himself to his quarters in the barn, leaving Yancey and Pearl alone. "Your boy's a good cook," Pearl commented. "Necessity," Yancey replied. "Can't work cattle on an empty stomach," she nodded, rising to help clear the dishes. "I can take over the cooking if you'd like, part of earning my keep." Yancey almost refused out of habit but reconsidered. Rusty's cooking while filling lacked variety. That would be appreciated. As they worked together to clean up, Yancey found himself studying Pearl when she wasn't looking. There was something about her that didn't quite fit her story. Her hands, though clearly accustomed to work, had a certain refinement. And her speech, though she seemed to consciously roughen it at times, occasionally revealed an education beyond what a simple rancher's daughter might have received. "You're not telling me everything about yourself, Miss Hawkins," he said finally. She paused, a dish in her hand. "You said you didn't care what I was running from." "I don't, but I do care if it's going to bring trouble to my door." Pearl set the dish down carefully. "It won't." "That part of my life is over." "Is it?" he pressed. She met his gaze. "It has to be." Yancey nodded slowly. "Fair enough." He reached for his hat. "I'll walk you back to your cabin. Cougar's been sighted in these parts." They walked in silence through the moonlit yard, the only sounds the distant lowing of cattle and the chorus of night insects. At her door, Pearl paused. "Thank you for the chance, Mr. Keller." "You earned your first day's wage," he said simply. "We'll see about the rest of the week." She smiled slightly. "Good night, then." "Good night, Miss Hawkins." Yancey returned to his cabin, unsettled by the woman's presence on his property. She was competent, hardworking, and kept to herself, all qualities he valued in a ranch hand. Yet there was something about Pearl Hawkins that disturbed the carefully constructed solitude of his life. The next few days fell into a rhythm of hard work from sunup to sundown. They branded the spring calves, repaired fences damaged by the storm, and began planning for hay cutting later in the summer. Through it all, Pearl worked tirelessly alongside the men, earning first Rusty's respect and then, reluctantly, Yancey's. On the fourth day, they rode to the far northern boundary of the property to check on a water source. Pearl had packed a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and dried apples, which they ate in the shade of a solitary oak tree. "This land of yours," Pearl said, breaking a companionable silence. "It's beautiful." Yancey looked around at the rolling hills and distant mountains. "It is," he agreed. "Took me 5 years to save enough to buy it." "What did you do before?" "Bit of everything. Drove cattle, worked mines, even tried my hand at bounty hunting for a spell." Pearl's expression flickered at that last revelation. "And now you're settled." "As much as a man can be in these parts." She seemed to consider her next question carefully. "No family?" Yancey's face hardened. "No, I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to pry." He shrugged, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "What about you? You mentioned your pa. Your mother still living?" "No," Pearl said, her voice soft. "She died when I was 16. Fever took her." "And your father, gone these past 3 years?" Yancey nodded. Loss was a common thread in the Westview families remained intact against the harsh realities of frontier life. "You never married?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. Pearl's face closed off. "Once, briefly." The finality in her tone discouraged further inquiry, and Yancey respected that boundary. They finished their meal in silence and returned to work. That evening, as Pearl prepared supper, Yancey rode into town for supplies. Florissant was small but growing, with a general store, a hotel, 2 saloons, and the requisite church. He tied his horse outside the general store and nodded to the proprietor, Sam Jenkins. "Yancey," the storekeeper greeted him. "Twice in 1 month, must be a special occasion." "Just need supplies, Sam," Yancey replied, handing over his list. As Sam gathered the items, Sheriff Miller entered the store. The lawman nodded to Yancey, then approached casually. "Heard you took on a new hand," the sheriff commented. "News travels fast," Yancey replied dryly. "Always does. Especially when it's a woman riding and roping like a man." Yancey continued examining the merchandise on the counter. "She does the work, that's all that matters." "Know anything about her?" Yancey looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Something I should know," Sheriff Miller shrugged. "Just curious." "Don't often see a woman traveling alone looking for ranch work. Times are changing." "That they are." The sheriff picked up a tin of tobacco. "She give a name?" "Pearl Hawkins." Miller nodded thoughtfully. "Doesn't ring any bells. Just be careful, Keller." Strange times bring strange folks through these parts. Yancey paid for his supplies and loaded them onto his horse. The sheriff's interest unsettled him, though he couldn't say exactly why. Pearl had proven herself honest and hardworking in the days she'd been at the ranch. Still, the woman had secrets that much was obvious. When he returned, he found Pearl and Rusty seated on the porch of the main cabin, Pearl mending a torn shirt while Rusty cleaned his revolver. The domestic scene struck Yancey as oddly comforting. "Supper's keeping warm," Pearl informed him, setting aside her sewing. After the meal, Rusty excused himself while Yancey lingered over a cup of coffee. Pearl was wiping down the table when he finally spoke. "Sheriff was asking about you in town." Her hand paused momentarily before continuing its motion. "What did he want to know?" "Just your name." "Said he was curious about a woman taking on ranch work." Pearl nodded slowly. "And what did you tell him, your name, that you do your job well?" He studied her carefully. "Should I have told him something else?" She met his gaze directly. "No, there's nothing else to tell, isn't there?" Yancey pressed. "I respect privacy, Miss Hawkins, but if there's trouble following you, I need to know." Pearl sat down across from him, her hands folded tightly on the table. "There's no trouble following me, Mr. Keller, not anymore." "What does that mean?" she sighed. "It means I've left that life behind. Whatever the sheriff might hear about me in the future has nothing to do with who I am now." Yancey considered her words. "Fair enough. Your past is your business long as it stays in the past." "It will," she assured him. The following morning, Yancey announced they would ride into town for supplies too bulky for his previous trip. Pearl seemed hesitant. "I can stay here," she suggested. "There's plenty to do." "Need an extra hand with the loading," Yancey countered. Rusty's staying to mind things here." Reluctantly, Pearl agreed. They rode side by side, the journey taking a little over an hour at a comfortable pace. As they approached town, Yancey noticed Pearl pulling her hat lower over her face. "Thought you said there was nothing to worry about," he commented. "There isn't," she replied. "But small towns talk. A woman in men's clothes draws attention." Yancey couldn't argue with that logic. Even in frontier towns, certain conventions remained. Florissant was busy that day, with a wagon train having stopped on its way west. The street was crowded with travelers stocking up before the next leg of their journey. Yancey and Pearl made their way to the mercantile, where they loaded their purchases onto the wagon Yancey had arranged to borrow. As they worked, Sheriff Miller approached, his gaze fixed on Pearl. "Miss Hawkins, I presume," he said, tipping his hat. Pearl straightened, meeting his gaze steadily. "Yes, sir, Sheriff Miller," he introduced himself. "New to our parts?" "Yes, sir. Just passing through when I found work with Mr. Keller." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Where you hail from originally?" "Missouri," she answered. "Then Kansas for a spell." "Kansas, you say, whereabouts?" "Dodge City most recently." The sheriff's expression changed almost imperceptibly. "Interesting place, Dodge. Know the Sutton family there?" Pearl's face revealed nothing. "Can't say that I do, Sheriff." He looked thoughtful. "Well, welcome to Florissant, Miss Hawkins. Hope you find our town agreeable." As the sheriff walked away, Yancey noticed Pearl's shoulders relax slightly. "Friend of yours?" he asked dryly. "Never met him before today," she replied. They finished loading the supplies and began the journey back to the ranch. Pearl was quieter than usual, her eyes frequently scanning the trail behind them. "He was fishing," Yancey said after a while. Pearl glanced at him. "What?" The sheriff, throwing out names to see if you'd react. She sighed. "I noticed." "So who are the Suttons of Dodge City?" "I wouldn't know." Yancey gave her a skeptical look. "You sure about that?" Pearl's expression hardened. "Mr. Keller, I've worked honestly for you these past days. I've kept to myself and caused no trouble. Isn't that enough?" He considered her words. "Suppose it should be." They rode in silence for a time before Pearl spoke again. "My week's almost up." "It is," he acknowledged. "Have I proved myself useful?" Yancey couldn't deny that she had. Pearl worked as hard as any man he'd hired, without complaint and with considerable skill. Moreover, the meals had improved dramatically under her care, and there was a certain comfort in having her presence around the ranch. "You can stay," he said finally, "if you want to." The relief in her eyes was evident, though she tried to mask it with a casual nod. "Thank you." "I appreciate that." That evening, after Rusty had retired to the barn and Pearl to her cabin, Yancey sat alone on his porch. The encounter with the sheriff troubled him more than he cared to admit. He'd managed 7 years of solitude, keeping the world and its complications at arm's length. Now, in the space of a week, a woman with secrets had disrupted that carefully maintained isolation. Worse, he found himself caring about those secrets and about her. The next morning, he rose early to find Pearl already at work in the garden behind the main cabin, weeding among the rows of vegetables that had been neglected since his previous cook left. "You don't have to do that," he said, approaching her. Pearl looked up, shielding her eyes against the morning sun. "I know, but it seems a shame to waste good growing ground." Yancey surveyed the garden. It had been Victoria's project initially, one of many attempts to make their brief marriage feel like a real home. After she left, he'd maintained it half-heartedly until eventually it became just another chore that never quite got done. "You like gardening?" he asked. "I find it peaceful," Pearl replied, returning to her work. "There's something hopeful about planting something and watching it grow." Yancey had never thought of it that way. To him, the garden had always been merely practical, a source of food, nothing more. "I was thinking we should ride out to check the north pasture today," he said, changing the subject. "Storm might have taken down some fencing up there." Pearl nodded. "I'll be ready after breakfast." The north pasture lay in the shadow of the mountains, with steeper terrain than the rest of the ranch. As they rode, Yancey found himself watching Pearl, the confident way she handled her horse, the alert awareness of her surroundings, the occasional smile when she caught sight of something that pleased her. They found the fence damaged in several places, likely from falling branches during the storm. Working side by side, they began repairs. The sun climbed high as they worked, and Yancey suggested a break near a small stream that cut through the property. "This is my favorite part of your land," Pearl commented as they rested in the shade. "It reminds me of home, my first home in Missouri." "You miss it?" Yancey asked. "Sometimes," she admitted, "the simplicity of it more than the place itself." Yancey understood that sentiment all too well. His own childhood in Tennessee felt like someone else's memory, now distant and idealized by time. "What brought you west?" he asked. Pearl was quiet for a long moment. "Same as everyone, I suppose, a chance for something different, a fresh start." "And your husband?" The question slipped out before he could think better of it. She stiffened visibly. "He stayed behind." "I'm sorry," Yancey said, recognizing he'd crossed a line. "Not my business." "No, it's not," she agreed, then sighed. "But I understand curiosity." She looked out across the landscape. "It was a mistake, the marriage. We both knew it almost immediately." Yancey nodded, surprising himself by offering, "Mine too." Pearl glanced at him with interest. "You were married, briefly." He rarely spoke of it to anyone. 7 years ago. "What happened?" Yancey picked up a stone and tossed it into the stream. "She wasn't who I thought she was." "People rarely are," Pearl said softly. "This was different." He hesitated, then continued. "I was working as a bounty hunter then. Good at tracking, good with a gun, made decent money bringing in wanted men." Pearl listened attentively as he continued. "Met Victoria in a small town in Wyoming. She was beautiful, refined, said she was a widow looking to start fresh out west." He laughed bitterly. "I fell hard, asked her to marry me after knowing her just 2 months. And she accepted. She did. We had a small ceremony, started building a life together. I even gave up bounty hunting, took more respectable work." He paused, the memories still raw despite the years. 6 months in, I came home early one day and found her going through my things, specifically my old bounty posters. When she saw me, she pulled a gun." Pearl's eyes widened. "She tried to kill you." She was ready to. Turned out her real name was Victoria Sloan. "She had a price on her head in 3 territories for robbery and murder. She'd married me thinking I might still have connections to the law that would help her stay informed about who was looking for her." "What did you do?" Yancey's face darkened. "I should have turned her in." "That would have been the right thing. Instead, I let her go, told her to disappear, never come back." "Did she?" "Far as I know, never heard from her again." He looked directly at Pearl. "After that, I swore I'd never trust another woman, never marry again. Seemed safer that way." Pearl nodded slowly. "I understand keeping people at a distance. It's protective, it's necessary," Yancey corrected. They fell silent, the confession hanging between them. Finally, Pearl stood. "We should finish the fence before dark." They worked efficiently through the afternoon, the shared confidences creating an unexpected bond between them. As the sun began to set, they packed up their tools and prepared for the ride back. Just as they mounted their horses, a shot rang out. Instinctively, Yancey pulled Pearl down behind a rocky outcropping. "Stay down," he ordered, drawing his revolver. Another shot hit the rock near their heads, sending stone fragments flying. "Who is it?" Pearl whispered, her own gun now in hand. "Can't tell," Yancey replied, peering cautiously around the edge of their shelter. "But they're up on that ridge to the north." A third shot confirmed his assessment. Someone was targeting them specifically with a rifle from a position of advantage. "Any enemies I should know about?" Pearl asked tightly. "None that would still be hunting me," Yancey replied. Then, with a pointed look, "You," Pearl's face paled. "I hoped." Another shot cut off her explanation, this one coming closer. "We need to move," Yancey decided. "They've got us pinned, but they'll have to reposition if we split up." Pearl nodded grimly. "What's the plan?" "I'll draw their fire. You circle around behind them from the east. There's a path up that ridge." "No," Pearl objected. I'll draw the fire, this is my fight, not yours. We don't know that, I do. Her expression was resolute. Trust me on this, Yancey. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and something in her eyes convinced him to agree. Be careful, he warned. On my signal, run for that stand of trees, I'll cover you. Pearl nodded, readying herself. Yancey counted to 3, then fired 2 quick shots toward the ridge. Pearl sprinted for the trees as Yancey provided covering fire. When she reached safety, she waved once before disappearing into the undergrowth. Yancey kept the shooter's attention focused on his position, firing periodically while watching Pearl's progress up the eastern slope. The sun was setting rapidly now, shadows lengthening across the landscape. It would be dark soon, an advantage for them if they knew the terrain, a disadvantage if their attacker had brought companions. The shooting from the ridge had stopped, suggesting the attacker was repositioning or had spotted Pearl's movement. Worried, Yancey broke cover and moved to a new position with a better view of the ridge. A shot rang out, then another. These came from different directions. Yancey's heart raced as he realized Pearl must be engaged with the shooter. He began making his way up the slope, moving as quickly as stealth allowed. When he reached the top of the ridge, the scene before him froze his blood. Pearl stood facing a man Yancey didn't recognize, both with guns drawn. The man was bleeding from his shoulder, clearly hit by one of Pearl's shots. "Hello, Elizabeth," the man was saying. "Or is it Pearl now, Gordon?" Pearl acknowledged, her voice steady despite the gun pointed at her. "How did you find me?" the man Gordon laughed. "You're predictable, Beth, always running to the same types of places, small towns, out-of-the-way ranches." "It's over, Gordon. Whatever you think I owe you, it's done." "Over," his voice hardened. "It's over when I say it's over. You took something that belongs to me." "I took nothing that was yours," Pearl replied. "Everything I had I earned." Gordon's laugh was ugly, including Judge Hawkins' name. "Tell me, does your rancher know he's harboring Samuel Hawkins' runaway wife?" Yancey's eyes widened at the revelation, but he kept his focus on the immediate threat. Gordon's gun hand was unsteady, his wound clearly affecting him. Still, at this range, he couldn't miss if he fired. "The judge is dead," Pearl or Elizabeth said flatly, "has been for 3 years. And yet you're still running." Gordon took a step closer. "The money, Beth, where is it?" "There is no money, Gordon. There never was." Gordon's face contorted with rage. "Don't lie to me." "Samuel had a fortune and you were his wife. When he died, he left everything to his children from his first marriage," Pearl interrupted. "I received nothing but his name, which I was entitled to keep." "You're lying." "I'm not." "And you know it, or you wouldn't have spent 3 years chasing me across 3 territories." Yancey could see Gordon's desperation growing, making him more dangerous. Carefully, he aimed his revolver at the man's back. "You always were a clever one," Gordon snarled. "Maybe too clever for your own good." He raised his gun higher, aiming directly at Pearl's heart. Before he could fire, Yancey's shot rang out, striking Gordon in the right arm. The man cried out in pain and surprise, his weapon falling to the ground. Pearl immediately kicked the gun away and trained her own on Gordon's chest. "It's over," she said firmly. Yancey approached, his revolver still aimed at Gordon. "You all right?" he asked Pearl without taking his eyes off the wounded man. "Yes," she replied. "Thank you." Gordon looked between them, clutching his bleeding arm. "You found yourself a protector, I see. Does he know who you really are?" "Shut up," Yancey ordered. "She's a thief and a liar," Gordon continued desperately. "Ask her about the Suttons in Dodge City. Ask her what happened to the judge's papers after he died." "I said, shut up." Yancey struck Gordon across the face with the butt of his revolver, knocking the man unconscious. In the sudden silence, Pearl's breathing sounded ragged. Yancey turned to her, taking in her pale face and the slight tremble in her hands. "We need to get him to town," he said, indicating Gordon. "Sheriff can sort this out." Pearl nodded woodenly. "Yes, and then," Yancey added, "we need to talk." They bound Gordon's wounds as best they could, then secured him across his own horse. The ride to town was tense and silent. darkness having fallen completely by the time they reached Florissant. Sheriff Miller was surprised to see them but took charge of the prisoner efficiently. "Want to tell me what happened?" he asked after Gordon had been locked in the town's small jail. Pearl explained the ambush and subsequent confrontation, though she omitted any mention of her connection to Gordon or his accusations. "He's wanted in Kansas," she concluded. "For theft and fraud, at least." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "You seem mighty certain of that, Miss Hawkins." "He admitted as much on the ridge," she replied smoothly. "Said he'd been working confidence schemes across Kansas and Colorado." Miller studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I'll send wires in the morning, see what comes back. In the meantime, I'll need statements from both of you." After providing their accounts and signing the necessary papers, Yancey and Pearl left the sheriff's office. The town was quiet, most businesses closed for the night. "The horses need rest," Yancey said. "We'll stay at the hotel and head back in the morning." Pearl nodded her agreement. The Florissant Hotel was small but clean, with a dining room that was just closing as they arrived. The proprietress, Mrs. Burns, took pity on their trail-worn appearance and arranged for simple meals to be brought to their rooms. Yancey secured 2 adjoining rooms, then guided Pearl upstairs. At her door he paused. "We need to talk," he reminded her. "I know," she acknowledged. "After we eat, I need some time." He nodded. "I'll knock in an hour." In his room, Yancey removed his dusty clothes and washed up using the basin provided. His mind raced with questions. Who was Pearl really? Elizabeth Hawkins, apparently widow of a judge, but what was her connection to Gordon? And what had the man meant about the Suttons in Dodge City? After eating the simple meal of cold chicken and bread, Yancey paced the small room. Finally, he knocked on the connecting door between their rooms. "Come in," Pearl called softly. She was seated by the window, her hair loose around her shoulders. In the lamplight, she looked younger and more vulnerable than he'd seen her before. "All right," Yancey said, taking the chair opposite her. "Time for the truth, all of it," Pearl nodded. "You deserve that much." She took a deep breath. "My real name is Elizabeth Hawkins, formerly Elizabeth Sutton. I was married to Judge Samuel Hawkins of Dodge City, Kansas. He was 40 years my senior." "How did that come about?" Yancey asked, careful to keep judgment from his voice. "My father died when I was 18, leaving significant debts. The judge was kind. He offered marriage as a solution to my financial troubles." She looked down at her hands. "It wasn't a love match, but he was decent to me. We were married for 3 years before his heart gave out." "And Gordon?" "Gordon Reed, the judge's clerk." Her expression hardened. "After Samuel died, Gordon convinced himself there was a fortune hidden somewhere. The truth is, the judge lived well but was not wealthy. What he had, he left to his grown children from his first marriage. So there was no money." "None that Gordon could claim," Pearl confirmed. "But he wouldn't believe that. He became obsessed, started following me, threatening me. Eventually, I felt I had no choice but to leave Dodge City. You ran." "I did. Changed my name slightly from Elizabeth to Pearl, but kept Hawkins." "It wasn't really deception, just simplification." Yancey considered this. "And the Suttons, your family," a flash of pain crossed her face. "My brothers disowned me when I married the judge. They thought I'd done it for money or position. We haven't spoken in years." "So everything you told me about Missouri was true?" "Yes. I grew up on a small cattle ranch there. Everything I told you about my skills was honest." She met his gaze directly. "I may have omitted parts of my past, Yancey, but I never lied about who I am." He nodded slowly, processing her story. "And now, what happens now that Gordon's caught?" "I don't know," she admitted. "I've been running for so long, I hardly know how to stop." Yancey understood that feeling all too well. Since Victoria, he'd been running in his own way, not across territories, but away from connections, from trust, from the possibility of being hurt again. "You could stay," he suggested, surprising himself. "Here, I mean in Florissant, on the ranch." Pearl looked up, hope and wariness battling in her expression. "As your ranch hand, if that's what you want." He hesitated, then added, "or as something else in time." The implication hung in the air between them. Pearl studied his face. You said you'd never trust a woman again." "I did say that," he acknowledged, "and I meant it at the time." "What's changed?" Yancey considered the question carefully. "I've watched you work, seen how you handle yourself. You're honest in ways that matter, even if you kept parts of your past private." He leaned forward. "We've both been betrayed, Pearl or Elizabeth, if you prefer." "Pearl is fine," she said softly. "I've grown used to it." "Pearl, then," he continued, "we've both been hurt by people we trusted. It makes a person careful. I understand that better than most." She nodded. "I never thought I'd find a place where I could stop running." "Maybe you have." The next morning, they ate breakfast in the hotel dining room before collecting their horses from the livery. Sheriff Miller intercepted them as they were preparing to leave. "Got a reply to my wire," he informed them. "Gordon Reed is indeed wanted in Kansas for fraud and attempted extortion. They're sending someone to collect him." He turned to Pearl. "Also got some interesting information about a Judge Hawkins' widow who disappeared from Dodge City 3 years ago." Pearl tensed visibly. "Is that so?" The sheriff nodded. "Seems there was quite a stir when she vanished. Some thought foul play, others thought she'd run off with courthouse funds." He studied her face. "Interesting thing is, no charges were ever filed." In fact, the judge's oldest son specifically told authorities his stepmother had every right to leave and start fresh elsewhere. Relief washed over Pearl's features. "The judge's son said that, according to the wire." The sheriff tipped his hat. "Safe journey back to your ranch, folks." "Miss Hawkins, I believe we can consider any concerns about your past resolved." As they rode out of town, Pearl was quiet, lost in thought. "You all right?" Yancey asked eventually. "I'm processing," she replied. "All this time I thought everyone believed the worst of me." "To hear that Samuel's son defended my right to leave." She shook her head wonderingly. "Maybe he knew the truth about his father's finances and understood you weren't after money." "Maybe." A small smile touched her lips. "It feels strange, the idea of not having to run anymore." "Good strange or bad strange?" "Good," she decided. "Definitely good." As they approached the ranch, Rusty rode out to meet them, clearly relieved to see them safe. "Was getting worried," he admitted, "when you didn't come back last night." "Had some trouble," Yancey explained briefly. "It's handled now." Over the next weeks, life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm. Pearl continued to prove her worth. Not just with cattle work, but in a dozen small ways the garden flourished under her care. The cabins became more comfortable with thoughtful touches, and meals became occasions to look forward to rather than mere necessity. For his part, Yancey found himself gradually lowering the walls he'd built around himself. The bitterness that had fueled his solitude for 7 years began to soften in Pearl's presence. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Yancey noticed Pearl wearing something he hadn't seen before, a pale blue ribbon tied around her wrist. "What's that?" he asked, gesturing to it. Pearl glanced down. "This, just a ribbon. Found it in town last time we were there." She touched it almost self-consciously. "Reminds me of one my mother used to wear in her hair." Yancey nodded, though something about the ribbon stirred a memory he couldn't quite place. "It suits you," he said simply. As summer turned to fall, the work on the ranch became focused on preparation for winter. They sold some cattle, stored hay, and reinforced buildings against the coming cold. Through it all, the bond between Yancey and Pearl deepened, though neither spoke openly of it. In October, they rode into town for supplies and learned that Gordon Reed had been transferred to Kansas to face charges there. The news lifted the last shadow from Pearl's spirits, and she laughed more freely than Yancey had ever heard. That evening, they attended a harvest dance at the town hall, the first social event Yancey had participated in for years. He felt awkward and out of place until Pearl took his hand for a dance. "I don't remember how to do this," he confessed as they joined the other couples. "Just follow my lead," she replied with a smile. "I'll make sure you don't step on my toes too badly." They danced, clumsily at first, then with growing confidence. Yancey couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so normal, so connected to another person and to the community around them. As they rode home under a sky brilliant with stars, Pearl reached over and touched his arm. "Thank you for tonight," she said softly. "It's been a long time since I felt like I belonged somewhere." "You do," Yancey assured her. "Belong here, I mean." In the moonlight, her smile was radiant. "I'm starting to believe that." The first snow fell in November, earlier than usual. Yancey and Pearl spent the day checking on the cattle, making sure they had access to feed and unfrozen water. By the time they returned to the ranch, the snow was falling heavily and darkness had fallen. "Should check on the stock in the barn before turning in," Yancey said as they unsaddled their horses. Pearl nodded. "I'll get a fire going in your cabin. We can have supper there." When Yancey entered his cabin later, he found it transformed. A cheerful fire blazed in the fireplace, the table was set for two, and the aroma of stew filled the air. Pearl had lit several lanterns, casting a warm glow throughout the room. Most surprising of all, Pearl herself had changed from her work clothes into a simple dress one he'd never seen her wear before. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, the blue ribbon he'd noticed earlier now tied at the end of a single braid. "This is unexpected," he said, suddenly aware of his own dusty, snow-dampened appearance. "There's warm water behind the screen," Pearl replied, gesturing to the washing area she'd prepared. "And I laid out a clean shirt for you." Yancey cleaned up as suggested, marveling at the effort Pearl had put into this simple meal. When he emerged, she was serving the stew into bowls. "What's the occasion?" he asked, taking his seat. "No occasion," she replied, though something in her expression suggested otherwise. "Just thought we deserved something nice after working in the snow all day." They ate companionably, talking of the ranch and plans for the winter. As they finished, Pearl rose to clear the dishes, but Yancey caught her hand. "Leave those," he said. "Sit with me by the fire." They settled in the two chairs pulled close to the hearth, the crackling of the fire the only sound for several comfortable minutes. Yancey found himself studying Pearl's profile in the firelight, struck by how natural her presence in his home had become. "I've been thinking," Pearl said eventually, breaking the silence, "about the future." "Oh," Yancey tried to keep his tone casual despite the sudden acceleration of his heart. "Yes," she turned to face him. "I've saved most of my wages. By spring, I'll have enough to maybe buy a small place of my own, nothing fancy but somewhere I could put down roots." The idea of Pearl leaving hit Yancey like a physical blow. "You're planning to leave?" "I wasn't saying that exactly." She hesitated. "But I can't be your ranch hand forever, Yancey." He nodded slowly, understanding the truth of her words. "What are you saying then?" Pearl took a deep breath. "I'm saying I need to know if there's a future for me here with you, not as your employee, but as more." The directness of her question took him by surprise, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Pearl had always been forthright once she began trusting him. "I swore I'd never marry again," he said quietly. "I know." Her expression remained steady, but he could see the hurt beginning to form in her eyes. "But that was before you," he continued. "Before I understood that not everyone betrays the trust you place in them." Hope flickered across her face. "What are you saying?" Yancey stood and moved to kneel before her chair, taking her hands in his. "I'm saying that promises made in bitterness sometimes need to be broken. I'm saying that I've come to care for you, Pearl Hawkins, more than I thought possible." Pearl's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I've come to care for you too." Gently, Yancey touched the ribbon in her hair. "This reminds me of something my grandmother once told me. She said when a woman ties a ribbon around something, she's claiming it as her own." He met Pearl's gaze. "Is that what you're doing, Pearl, claiming a place here?" "Perhaps," she admitted softly, "if there's a place for me to claim." "There is," he squeezed her hands. "With me if you want it." The first tear spilled down Pearl's cheek. "I do want it, very much." Yancey reached up to wipe away her tear. "Then stay. Not as my ranch hand, but as my partner, my wife, if you'll have me." Pearl's smile bloomed through her tears. "Are you sure, after everything you swore?" "Some vows are meant to be broken," he said firmly. "Especially those made in pain and anger. I'd rather make new ones to you based on truth and trust." Yes, Pearl whispered, leaning forward until their foreheads touched. Yes, I'll stay. I'll be your wife. They were married on Christmas Day in the small church in Florissant. The ceremony was simple, attended by Rusty and a few townspeople who had come to know and respect them both. Pearl wore a modest blue dress with the ribbon woven into her hair, and Yancey wore the only suit he owned, purchased years ago for a funeral and hastily altered by Mrs. Burns from the hotel. As they spoke their vows, snow fell gently outside the church windows, transforming Florissant into a vision from a fairy tale. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Yancey felt the last of his bitterness melt away, replaced by a cautious joy he'd never expected to feel again. "Never thought I'd see the day," Rusty commented at the small reception afterward. "You swearing off weddings was about the one thing I thought you'd never change your mind on, boss." Yancey smiled, watching Pearl across the room as she accepted congratulations from Mrs. Burns. "Sometimes a man needs to be reminded what's worth fighting for. That ribbon did it," Rusty observed. "Saw it in your hair at the harvest dance, Mrs. Keller," he called to Pearl. "That's when I knew the boss was a goner," Pearl laughed, coming to join them. "Is that so?" "You tied it around more than your hair," Yancey said quietly. "You tied it around my heart." Spring came early the following year, bringing with it new life on the ranch. The cattle delivered healthy calves, Pearl's garden flourished, and construction began on an addition to the main cabin, a proper bedroom and a larger kitchen. One warm evening in May, Pearl and Yancey sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and pink. Pearl's hand rested on her slightly rounded belly, evidence of the child that would join them in the fall. "Did I ever tell you," she said, breaking a comfortable silence, "that my mother believed blue ribbons brought good fortune?" Yancey smiled. "Is that why you wore it in your hair at our wedding?" "Partly." She reached into her pocket and withdrew the now familiar ribbon, slightly faded from wear. "I also wore it because it reminded me of something." "What's that?" "That sometimes the things we think will bind us actually set us free." She took his hand and placed the ribbon in his palm. "I ran for so long, Yancey. You stayed in one place but locked yourself away. We were both prisoners of our pasts," he nodded, understanding her meaning. "And now we're free together." Pearl smiled, her hand returning to her belly. "With the future right here before us." Yancey carefully tied the ribbon around her wrist, the way she had worn it when he first noticed it. "To remind us," he said, "that the vows worth keeping are the ones that bring joy, not pain." As twilight deepened into night, they remained on the porch, talking softly about names for their child, plans for the ranch, dreams for the years ahead. The fears and wounds of the past hadn't disappeared entirely, such things never do, but they had transformed into something else. Wisdom, caution tempered with hope, and the knowledge that trust, once broken, could indeed be rebuilt, stronger than before. In the small cemetery on the hill behind their ranch, a simple stone marked the symbolic burial of their former selves, the bitter widower who had sworn off love, and the frightened widow who had run from her own shadow. In their place stood a man and woman who had found, in each other, the courage to begin again. And around Pearl's wrist, the blue ribbon remained a gentle reminder that sometimes the tenderest bonds are the ones that set us free.